Hey guys, we're about to go live here in the permanent weight loss community on Facebook, and we didn't get any questions this week for whatever the reason, even though we had an influx of people. But we're actually going to be going over something. It's kind of been the theme of my week in terms of my messaging to the permanent weight loss community, to my clients, to my paid group members. And so I want to share this all with you, where it started from. And I learned about this many years ago, but let's just go live here and then we'll get into it, all right? So just give me 1 second. All right, we're just loading it up on Facebook, going live. All right, it's fetching the preview. And making sure I didn't get any... all right, no questions. So we're going to get going here in 3, 2, 1. Hey everybody, welcome to the Weight Loss by Pete podcast, and welcome to our weekly live video here in the permanent weight loss community. I'm Pete Weintraub, permanent weight loss specialist. We're live again, like I said, here in the permanent weight loss community. And this is going to be uploaded later on in the day to my YouTube channel, as well as to my podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Stitcher. And every week I ask you guys what questions you have about health, nutrition, fitness, mindset, and obviously the reason you're all here, permanent weight loss. And despite a few attempts this week, it's a rare instance where I don't get at least one question. We didn't get a question, but that's okay, because there's been a theme to my week. And it all started on Tuesday, and I'm going to relay the whole story to you, and then a little bit about why some of the dietary recommendations that I recommend are contrary to popular opinion, but are still incredibly effective. If you comment in here, if you have any additional questions you'd like me to answer, I will be checking periodically, but as is often the case, I am on a separate piece of software that is simultaneously streaming this to Facebook Live, so I can upload pictures and things like that, so I can give you guys a better understanding. So before the holidays, so before Christmas, I actually ended up having my bloods done. So every couple of years I have my bloods done. I used to have a general physician, but unfortunately we had an instance a few years back where I had my blood work done then, and he had called me in. I went into his office, and of course, just like most appointments there, it was rushed. I got maybe 2 minutes with him. It was literally like a conveyor belt type thing, and that's a huge issue in the medical community at this point, but not really what we're talking about here. So he told me that my bloods came back, everything was perfect, but my cholesterol levels were high. So I said, okay, I understand that. Why do you suppose that is? And was it the good cholesterol or bad cholesterol that was high? And he said, well, it was actually your good cholesterol that was high. And to give you guys a long story short, there's two types of blood serum cholesterol. It's not even really cholesterol that they measure. There's LDL and HDL. LDL, which is considered the bad cholesterol, has two different types, which we'll get into in a minute. And then there's the good cholesterol, HDL. So at the time, my HDL was high. And he was like, well, it's your HDL. And obviously that, in order to get total cholesterol, you just add LDL with HDL, and you get your total cholesterol levels. And I said, okay, so what's the problem? This guy wasn't just a general physician, but he was also a fellow of cardiology. So I was very, very upset about that, and I decided, you know what? If I can trip up a doctor with several years of training and someone who's supposed to know a lot more about medicine, the human body and whatnot than I do, then I'm not staying there. So fortunately, I have a friend now who is a doctor, and I was able to get a prescription and get the blood work. So when I finally got it back this past Tuesday, I saw the following results here. So let me pull it up for you. So you can see here that it shows you it's through LabCorp, and they have a website, and basically it shows that my total cholesterol was high, barely. You know, the normal range you see here is 100 to 199, and I was at 202, so that's not a big deal. But my LDL this time was high. So I thought at first, well, I didn't really think at first because I've known this for years, but a lot of people would be concerned, and obviously if I had a general type of doctor, they would have said, all right, not only is your total cholesterol high, but your bad cholesterol is high. So let me explain a couple of things and dispel a couple of myths that your doctors probably aren't going to tell you. For starters, LDL being high doesn't necessarily mean that you're at an increased risk of heart disease. And like I mentioned in the beginning, there are two types of LDL particles. The first type, which you get usually when you eat a diet high in saturated fat, is a large and fluffy type that obviously will increase the serum levels that are measured during a routine blood test. So that's the type that I most likely have. If I wanted to get a more thorough analysis, there's actually a specific blood test called an NMR lipoprofile that would enable me to figure out whether or not my non-harmful LDL, which is that large fluffy type that you get when you eat saturated fat, is the case, or if it's the smaller, denser LDL particle, and that is what constricts your arteries and obviously increases your chances of having a cardiovascular incident. So I figured I was fine. I know I'm fine. I feel great. I'm in the best shape of my life. I have more mental clarity than I've ever had, and I know I have nothing to worry about. But most doctors, if they saw this for you and they saw these results on your test, you might be put on a statin. And statins, while they do reduce inflammation and they do potentially reduce your risk, it's estimated that between 75 to 150% of folks who are prescribed the statin don't actually need it. And there are other studies that show that if your total cholesterol is 200 or higher, which mine is at, then you're actually at a lessened risk of heart disease. That's actually the inverse. If you have a cholesterol level of 150 or below, your chances of developing heart disease are 22% higher for every 30 points you drop. That's obviously not good. So why is this happening? So I want to tell you a quick story about how this happens, just so I can give you some perspective on it. So back in the late 40s, early 50s, the incidence of heart disease in the United States went up significantly. And obviously the medical community and the scientific communities were rushing to try and figure out what was going on. And there were several studies that came out during that time in the late 40s into the early 50s that showed a potential correlation between increased sugar intake, increased grain intake, increased corn intake in the population. And as we started ingesting more and more of that, we became sicker and sicker and more susceptible to heart disease. So a guy by the name of Ancel Keys came into the picture, and Keys is the founder of the Mediterranean diet, which you've probably heard of. He's also famous for his 7-country study, which reviews the diets of 7 countries worldwide that ate a high-carb, low-fat diet, like the U.S. dietary guidelines have been for the last 60-plus years, and that's partially thanks to him. And he was hell-bent on this hypothesis that all dietary fat is bad for you. And that's actually not true. There are different types of dietary fat. The ones that he demonized were saturated fats primarily. And this was also due to the fact that the sugar, corn, and grain industries knew that they were in trouble. That if any of the research that had come out during the late 40s into the early 50s came out, then there was a very good chance that they would suffer significant financial losses, because obviously people don't want to die of heart disease. They would stop eating that stuff and kind of go back to what they had been eating prior to this mass introduction of these foodstuffs into our diet. And there's a bunch of stuff that's come out in recent years. I'll show you here. So how the sugar industry shifted blame to fat. There are articles in the New York Times all over the place that show you this type of stuff. And there have been books written about it. In fact, right now I have another group. It's a private group, a paid group of folks, and we're doing a book club this month. We're reading a book called The Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teicholz. And there are other books like Good Calories, Bad Calories, and believe it or not, because as you can see from this pictograph again, how the sugar industry shifted blame to fat, there's documentation, written documentation during this time of sugar lobbyists, grain lobbyists, corn lobbyists infiltrating Washington and getting them to write into their legislation these dietary guidelines. So obviously the food pyramid came out, and then shortly in recent years, My Plate came out, which is essentially the food pyramid with a few minor tweaks, and obviously instead of a pyramid, you got a plate, and it all influences a high-carb, low-fat diet. A lot of Western civilizations around the world, including many in Europe, do not abide by this anymore. In fact, a lot of the restrictions on dietary cholesterol intake, saturated fat, has been taken away from their country's dietary guidelines. But for whatever the reason, probably due to these same political factors that were evident as far back as 60 years ago, we're not able to do this. So we've been eating a high-carb, low-fat diet. It's what we've been taught in school, in our health classes, in our nutrition classes, and even when I started getting certified and started getting educated on this subject, this is what ended up happening. This is what I was taught, this is what I followed, and it was no wonder that after the eat less, exercise more, that got me to lose 40 pounds inside of 4 months. I plateaued for nearly 3 years. But I want to show you what the negative effects of this type of diet are. We've been over this before, but really quickly. You can see here, if you're watching, if you're not, I'll describe it. There's a graph, all right? The y-axis is blood sugar, x-axis is time. So it shows you essentially your blood sugar levels over time after you ingest these different macronutrients. Macronutrients being carbs, proteins, and fats. So if you eat a high-carb diet, you're significantly spiking your blood sugar, and then you're having this drop. So you see this huge apex at the top and then the significant drop, all done in a short period of time. Protein is a little more delayed, but protein still elicits a decent insulin response. So that's why a lot of people who eat a high protein, low fat, low carb diet will still have trouble losing weight, because they're still eliciting this, even though it's moderate in comparison to carbohydrate, this significant insulin response, and they're storing fat over time. If you look at dietary fat, on the other hand, you see there's barely any change. It's more of like a steady, a slight increase and then a steady state of energy. So that's good. But if you are eating a high carbohydrate diet, you're going to stimulate a process called the insulin resistance cycle. We went over this either last week or the week before. Basically, long story short, starting at the top here, if you're watching, if you're listening, don't worry. I'll explain what it shows. It's essentially a little ovular thing. So at the top, there's this thing that says eat food. So you're eating a high carbohydrate diet, and then your body has to produce insulin, which is the next thing, in order to begin to metabolize this excess in blood sugar. Your cells then start to begin to resist insulin over time, because your body's no longer insulin sensitive. It's constantly deploying it. You usually become a grazer, because like we saw in this graph here, when you eat a high carbohydrate meal, you do get that energy spike, but then you get that energy drop. And that's because insulin is deployed. Everything we need in that moment is sent to the appropriate cells, muscles, and tissues. The rest is stored as fat. So when you go back to this insulin resistance cycle, that's what ends up happening. So you can see here, after your cells begin to resist insulin, your sugar stores as fat. And in the short term, you feel tired and hungry. So we got that 2 o'clock feeling that's talked about in the 5-hour energy commercials. But in the long run, as you can see, bam, look at the two things on the bottom here. Cells begin to resist insulin, aka insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is a fancier way of saying you're either pre-diabetic or eventually type 2 diabetic. And then the thing next to it, in the next rung, is that the excess is stored as fat. So if the excess is stored as fat, it has that compound effect over time. So if you gradually gained weight over the years, if it wasn't a quick thing like it was for me, though I struggled with it most of my life due to faulty dietary advice, both in school and at home through the media and through our government, you're going to get heavy, and your chances of diabetes increases significantly. And those two things are gateway diseases. So obviously either or can kill you, but usually because those two things leads to more deadly chronic conditions. And those things include 8 of the top 10 killers in the United States, according to the CDC studies that came out. I spoke about this a few weeks back. So a lot of the things that we're dying from in the United States and in much of the Western civilization is just preventable, and heart disease isn't common. in human beings. If you look at general populations, indigenous populations like the Maasai and like the Inuit in the Arctic and all over the world, people who have been relatively untouched by Western civilization and processed foods and high carbohydrate diets, you'll notice that they don't eat a high carbohydrate diet. That what Ansel Keys proposed it's not the norm in the world, it's actually a rarity. And that there was compounding evidence, not just in studying different countries. He even had different things called like the French and Swedish paradoxes, which was they were eating diets high in saturated fat and yet their heart disease rates were low. And why is that? To him, it was just a paradox. No, it's because of how our bodies are designed. So look again at this graph. The human body metabolizes fat best, protein second, carbohydrates third. If you're eating a diet high in carbohydrates, then you're going to get heavier, a much higher likelihood of getting heavier, and of getting sick. So that's obviously not what you want. So to finish things off here, I prescribe, once my clients get food quality down, and really quickly, food quality, you can find it in the 5 strategies report. It's in the description to the permanent weight loss community. If you're watching this at a later or listening at a later time on YouTube, iTunes, SoundCloud, or Stitcher, I'm going to post it in the description below, so don't worry, you'll get access to it. It's essentially a free report, details the 5 strategies I personally use to lose 100 pounds. A couple of them are about nutrition specifically and nutrition quality. But to review that quickly, you want to eat meats, non-starchy vegetables, raw nuts and seeds, low glycemic fruit, half a cup or less of starch at any meal, and preferably non-grain-based starch, so natural starch, and no added or processed sugar. That is quality nutrition in a nutshell. Once you have that down, I prescribe macronutrient ranges for my clients. And it was funny, actually. I have an email list, too, that I send out similar information to. So usually every day I have a theme that I'll talk about, that I'll write about. And when I proposed this a week or so back, it showed these daily ratios. If you hear a dog barking, I'm sorry. Mailman always comes around this time. Unfortunately, this is the only time I have on Thursday to really sit down and do this for you. But I prescribe these macronutrient ratios, all right? So based on that blood sugar graph that I showed you before, right? So looking at our insulin responses, fat has by far the least, protein is second, carbohydrate third. So one would think, just intuitively, you want to eat your macros at their respective ranges. And this is also based on a great deal of evidence I've done, not just on like the ketogenic diet, which is an extremely high fat diet. They recommend you eat anywhere from 70 to 80% of your dietary intake from fat. I'm a little more liberal with this because these ratios are the lower ends of the spectrum and seem to still get the best results. They did it for me when I was on my 100-pound weight loss journey, and they've helped several of my clients. So fat you want to eat 60 to 70% of the time, protein 20 to 30%, and then carbs 0 to 10%. If you're able to keep it within that range, your chances of A, gaining weight, or B, becoming insulin resistant are slim to none. And chances are, if you're watching this, you want to lose weight and improve your health, and you'll find that you'll be able to do that. I can't tell you how many clients I've had in the last decade, which is how long I've been doing this, that have gone to their doctors. They've come to me because they had a bad doctor's checkup. They got their bloods done, things were high, they were worried, they go back, and everything looks good. Everything goes down into the quote-unquote normal ranges. And now in many cases, a lot of the blood work that they do and a lot of the ranges they have are fairly accurate in terms of discerning whether or not certain parts of your body are functioning optimally, or whether you're at risk or not for developing a debilitating health condition. These will help you get to that point. And like I said, I went through my bloods, and outside of cholesterol, there was nothing else that was out of the normal range. And like I said earlier and explained earlier, your cholesterol levels don't mean anything in terms of that. LDL and HDL, they're not even cholesterol. They're lipoproteins. They are lipoproteins. And LDL Just because mine is high doesn't mean that I'm at risk for heart disease because I eat a diet high in saturated fat. I know that the vast majority of the LDL in my blood is not the small, dense, and dangerous type. It's a large, fluffy, non-dangerous type. And there are studies, numerous studies, which you can look up if you want on PubMed, that show that saturated fat is no longer linked to cardiovascular disease. This is starting to be published. This is starting to come to light. And the only issue now is that the federal government here in the United States, the association like the American Heart Association, they do not want to come out and say, we are sorry, we have misinformed the public. There's a reason that the incidences of type 2 diabetes, obesity, heart disease, and cancer have not improved. In fact, they've skyrocketed in the last 60 years. It's because we gave you faulty information, and while big outlets like the New York Times here are coming out and showing that this was in part paid off by governmental bureaucrats. The sugar industry paid off governmental bureaucrats, if you want to read that article, to say carbs are okay, high carb, low fat diet, eat it, you can eat as much sugar as you want, whatever you want, but stay away from dietary fat. Dietary fat is the enemy. It goes against basic human biology. And one of the few things I remember from my high school biology class was that there's 3 macronutrients, which we all know, carbs, proteins, and fats again, and 2 are essential, which means we need to ingest those in order to function optimally. Carbs are not one of the 2 essential macronutrients. That's protein and fat. And as you can see from this blood sugar graph in terms of the effects that this has in our blood sugar, and look, weight gain, weight loss is all about your insulin sensitivity and your insulin response. And if you're constantly having these huge dips and drops in your blood sugar levels as opposed to more moderate or regulated blood sugar levels that you'll get from eating a diet higher in fat, moderate protein, low carb, you're going to really suffer some negative health consequences, not just weight gain, but you can become diabetic. And like I said, that opens up the floodgates for things that you can't do nearly as much about. At least with type 2 diabetes, you can. And I've helped clients in the past actually reverse their type 2 diabetes diagnosis because you can. You give it to yourself, whether knowingly or unknowingly, but there's something you can always do about it. So I hope this helped educate you a little bit in terms of why I may seem a little unconventional, but hey, I've lost 100 pounds doing this. I continue to eat this way 80 to 90% of the time. I do allow wiggle room. I do, quote unquote, live a little bit, but I find, and I'm sure you'll find too, the more healthy you eat, the less and less crap you'll eat or drink, and you'll find that you just feel better. I used to have terrible pains in my neck, my spine, my knees, my hips, and in my mid-20s, I couldn't move. I loved playing softball. I'm sure many of you have heard that, and I couldn't move. And now I'm limber, like I'm lean, I'm more powerful and explosive than I've ever been, I'm faster than I've ever been, and I don't have aches and pains, and I feel like when I'm done with the workout, I can keep going for hours and hours if I want to. I used to be wiped out after playing a couple of games of softball on a Sunday morning. Now I play 2 doubleheaders every Sunday, so I play in 4 games, and during the summer when it's hot and humid, that's not fun, but I get through it and I have energy to last the entire time because now I'm fueling my body the right way and everything is taking care of itself. And as you saw from my bloods, there was nothing wrong with it. So I hope you guys found this helpful. Tune in every Thursday at noon Eastern Standard Time, and please give me your questions. It can be about anything. It can even be about the mental side. It doesn't always have to be about the physical stuff, guys, because you can have all the appropriate information in terms of how to lose weight. But if you don't have your mindset in the right place, then you're going to have a lot of trouble sticking to it. Thanks so much for watching. If you're watching this on YouTube or listening on my podcast, please feel free to subscribe. I'm going to be coming out with 5 videos and podcasts a week, and I thank you again for watching. This is Pete Weintraub, Permanent Weight Loss Specialist, signing off. I'll talk to you guys next Thursday here in the Permanent Weight Loss community, and if you're, again, watching on YouTube or listening to my podcast, I'll be coming at you tomorrow on Friday. Take care. All right, guys, thanks so much for watching. Talk to you soon.